The context was an impasse in historical research about the timing, nature, and scale of Mediterranean trade in the early Middle Ages. Early in the 20th century, Alphonse Dobsch, an Austrian economic historian, had argued powerfully for the deep continuity of economic structures and systems between the Roman Empire and the early medieval kingdoms of the medieval West, the Germanic successor states to the Roman Empire. A very great Belgian economic historian, Henri Pirenne, came to a very different conclusion. He allowed and reckoned that the economic structures stayed continuous past the barbarian invasions into the Merovingian period, into the 6th century, that at the beginning of medieval history, Merovingian Gaul was integrated into the trading system of the Mediterranean and its gold standard. The big change came in the late 7th or 8th century, according to Pirenne, and that change was made by Islam. The rise of Islam drove a powerful wedge through the middle of the Mediterranean trading system, cut Western Europe off from the vibrant trading economy, gold-based standard of the Mediterranean, former Roman and now Islamic world. And as a result, Western Europe was forced to build its way very slowly and rather grimly out of its agrarian resources and to turn away from the Mediterranean toward the Atlantic as the new center for its economic and trading development. Medieval European trade, and therefore cities, according to Pirenne, only got going again after the year 1000 in the 11th and 12th centuries and centered around the Atlantic. A third position after Pirenne was developed by a French scholar named Maurice Lombard, and he argued that, in fact, the Carolingians had entered into, or Carolingian Europe had entered into contact with the Muslims, and that a flourishing trade began to develop, which would lay the groundwork for future European trading networks. The difficulty with this is that he did not advance much substantive evidence in favor of this thesis from the periods that he was discussing. My approach was quite different. The reason for the impasse is that there is only a very small number of explicit references to trade in the surviving written record from the early Middle Ages. The elites who dominated the production of the narrative sources that survive were not much interested in trade and therefore speak of it very little. The result is that you have a dozen explicit descriptions of long-distance traders between, say, 550 and 850, and it's difficult to tell whether those traders are the exception or the rule, whether they're the tip of a hidden iceberg or there is no iceberg there. So opinions differed and controversy continued and there was no resolution. I took a quite different approach, a prosopographical approach, and tried to construct the collective biography of travelers between Western Eurasia, between Western Europe and the Mediterranean, the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean world, between about 700 and 900. To my astonishment, I found that there were far more of them than I had anticipated. I counted a bit over 660 travelers of various descriptions. When one laid the details of the travels of these 660 individuals, some of which were known in great detail, others of which were known only very, very partially and incompletely, when one laid all these patterns out, one saw a surprisingly new picture of the development of the structures of communication that linked Western Europe with the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. Around the year 750, there was only one way to get from Paris to, say, the Middle East, and that was to travel down to the Rhone River, travel down the Rhone River to Marseille, get in one ship, go around the coast to Rome, probably change ships multiple times in the course of your travel from Rome to Sicily, around Greece, up into the Aegean, into the Byzantine Empire, and getting another ship and going along the coast of Asia Minor before you finally reached, for example, the Holy Land. That was it. That was pretty much the only game in town, and that is what emerged from the prosopography. By the time you get to 850, you have many more travelers, and you have at least half a dozen different routes that are actively moving people between East and West. You now have people traveling out of Venice going directly south to Africa or east to the Holy Land. You have people traveling you still have the old main trunk route going. You have people traveling overland through the Balkans across the ancient Via Egnatia, the Roman road through the Balkans to Constantinople. You have a route opening up along the Danube River in the middle of the 9th century, second half of the 9th century. You have another land route that goes via Muslim Spain over to Africa and by land or sea along North Africa toward the Middle East. And finally, you have the Viking route that opens up from one end to the other, certainly in the second half of the 9th century, by which one could travel by sea from the North Sea up to the Viking trading towns of Scandinavia, then over to the rivers that run through Russia, down one river to the Black Sea, another to the Caspian Sea, and thus linking Europe to the Muslim East and to Byzantium via a northern arc. So this was a completely new structure, and the question then arose, once I could see these new structures and could date their appearance, whether they tied into other bigger patterns, for example, economic developments. I was still stuck with the small number of explicit mentions of traders and long-distance travelers in the written sources, and so I turned to the testimony. After looking at the testimony of people, I turned to the testimony of things. And the first thing I looked at was relics, because little pieces of a holy man or woman's body were extremely prized in Western European society in this period, and they were collected avidly and carefully registered when they came in. So I knew that there would be records. And what I did was I studied two hoards of relics created in two different towns in France, in a royal monastery, a convent of royal princess nuns called Chelles, east of France, and in the Cathedral of Sens in France. I studied the tags by which the relics were identified, because one jawbone looks pretty much like another. And I identified where the tag, what the saint was, and therefore we knew where the saint's relic's main depository was, and one could deduce where the person who made the tag believed that the relic came from. And so I was able to make a pattern of the changing horizons from which saints' relics were recruited for these collections between about 600 and 900. Generally speaking, the broad pattern of these geographical horizons conformed to the new structures that had emerged from the analysis of travelers' movements. Whether or not the relics were truly what the person who put them in the shrine thought they were is less consequential than the fact that the person who put them there believed that these relics could come to him or her from this place, from Jerusalem, from Alexandria, from Carthage, from Constantinople, at the time that they placed them in the box. There had to be existing context for them to believe that this was even plausible. From the testimony of relics, I looked at other things. I looked, for example, at the import of silks as recorded in the written records. Silks were not produced in Western Europe in this time. They had to all come from the Middle East or from points farther east, Central Asia, China, perhaps India. And so I looked at the import patterns of silks and mentions of silks. I looked at the dating and localization of actual surviving silks that had been studied by an art historian archaeologist. The broad patterns conformed. Finally, I turned to an object whose origins are incontrovertible: coins struck in the Islamic world, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Marcher kingdoms of the Caspian Sea area, from Central Asia, from the silver mints there. And I looked at the coins, Arab coins that had been deposited inside the territory of the Carolingian Empire. I cataloged them, looked at their dates. I looked at coins minted so these Arab coins are minted in Baghdad, in Tunis, in Samarkand, and are found in France, in Germany, in northern Italy. I looked at coins issued by the Byzantine Empire, minted mostly in Constantinople, but some in Sicily and a few other places, and their patterns of import, the ones that have been found inside the territory or on the boundaries of the Carolingian Empire. Finally, I looked at the mention of of the mentions of coins in contemporary documents, the mentions of Arabs and a few Byzantine coins in contemporary documents, and mapped these virtual coins that had existed when they were paid or used for payment and recorded in a contemporary document of the 8th or 9th century, mostly from Italy. And I mapped all of these. And lo and behold, the pattern seemed to fit pretty well to that which had emerged from the original study of the changing structures of communication and, I supposed, commerce. The final stage was to try to view these different patterns, spatial and temporal patterns, in the context of what we could recover about the economic exchanges between Western Europe and the southern and eastern Mediterranean in this period. And to make a long story short, what we found was if you're getting all these Arab and Byzantine coins being deposited in the West, it's a strong indicator that Western Europe is running a positive balance of trade with the more advanced economies of the Islamic Caliphate and to a certain extent with Islamic Spain and with the Byzantine Empire. We can see clearly in these written sources and in the archaeological evidence that silks were imported from the East, that spices were imported from the East, and of course that the coins were imported from the East. What did the West have to send in return? A careful investigation indicated three major categories of goods which could be documented: furs, high-quality swords, and Europeans. The slave trade played a very important role in the birth of the European economy. In some sense, the initial growth of the Carolingian and Western European economy was financed by the export of the product of Europe's forests and of Europe's wars on its boundaries. The furs, the swords, and European slaves who were shipped to Africa and to Asia to finance the beginnings of the Western commercial economy. Venice then, in subsequent centuries, would build on the capital that it acquired in the 8th and 9th centuries in very profitable ways and shift the axes of its trade away from the Islamic world toward Byzantium, and the rest is history. So in a nutshell, the impasse that this book wound up addressing was due to the fact that historians were looking at the written evidence, basically in the narrative sources, and there wasn't much of it, and interpretations could differ. You didn't know whether the half a dozen or dozen pieces of evidence that we had for this whole big problem of the development of trade in the Mediterranean, existence or not, and scope of trade and nature of trade in the Mediterranean in the 8th and 9th centuries. You didn't know whether the written evidence was the exception or the rule. And my solution, which I really happened upon unintentionally, but fortune does favor the prepared mind, as they say, was to shift the focus from the small number of highly controverted explicit references to trade to implicit references to trade and communications, to commerce and communications. And so I did a history of movements, of the movements of all kinds of people, whether they were ambassadors, whether they were pilgrims, whether they were the small number of merchants, whether they were slaves being shipped across the ocean, and reasoned that an ambassador traveling from Paris to Constantinople did not ride down from the Alps and build a ship in which to sail to Constantinople, but got in a ship that was going to Constantinople. And in most cases, these would have been merchant vessels, as indeed was possible. It was possible to demonstrate. So the first thing I did was to look at a different type of evidence, the evidence for movements rather than the evidence for commerce per se, the evidence for movements which could be reconstructed from the details of the lives of individuals who traveled. The second thing I did was to look for types of evidence that might confirm or contradict that. I looked at archaeological evidence. I looked at the pattern of shipwrecks. I looked at the survival of silks that had to have been imported into Western Europe from the Middle East or points beyond. I looked at the coins, the numismatic evidence, the evidence of actual surviving Arab or Byzantine gold and silver or bronze coins, where they were minted in the Arab world or in the Byzantine Empire, when they were minted, and where and when they were deposited in Europe. And I looked at texts that mention the circulation of foreign coins in and around the Empire of Charlemagne, and was able to put this information together with all kinds of other historical evidence referring to trade and markets, and by putting together types of evidence which had never been considered for this problem, it was possible to bring to bear a significant quantity of new information, new evidence on an old and very controversial question. And I think that the ability to shift away from the same small set of evidence that historians had been arguing about to incorporate the other evidence that was relevant to the question but had been perceived as such in the written sources, and then to begin to incorporate the archaeological evidence, I think was the secret of coming to the new conclusions that I was able to draw. For the future, for the present and the future, to my surprise, the archaeological evidence has already begun to come in and show, for example, that the Venice, which appears as a significant trading center already in the 8th century, was not alone. That it had a rival that's being archaeologically investigated right now by Sauro Geliki and our Italian colleagues at Comacchio in the Po Delta, and showing that indeed the communications and the commerce was beginning perhaps even earlier than I thought to recover with the Middle East, and particularly with the Byzantine Empire in the case of Comacchio. We can expect in future from more natural scientific investigations that are able to track the migrations of people, both through the isotopic signatures in their teeth and in their bones, which allow us to determine from where that someone came from someplace other than where they're buried, and often where indeed they came from, as well as the growing ancient genetic evidence, the genomic evidence that is preserved both in the modern genomes of people who live in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Europe. The modern genomes may preserve records of the movements of intermarriage, or at least intercopulation, with peoples from abroad, and conversely, we may be able to see similar signatures in modern genomes spread throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa from people who were imported in the 8th and 9th centuries, and of course the ancient DNA, the genetic evidence of the skeletons of the people themselves, has a powerful story to tell, and we can expect that in coming years, as the scientific archaeology really takes off, as it is doing now, that there'll be a lot of new stories told to deepen, to improve and correct the picture that I tried to draw based on the sources that were available to me in the closing years of the 20th century.